Recently, one of my YouTube viewers asked a really great question, something that I thought was interesting enough to turn into a video, and that's what I'm doing right here with another top 10 list. So the question was, which ancient works of philosophical literature that have been lost and we don't have any longer would you most like to have and be able to read and find out what's going on in them? And so that is a really interesting idea, because it's sort of like getting what we used to call a grab bag, where you reach in and you don't actually know what's there. It could turn out that we get a lost work by Epicurus and we're like, oh, it wasn't very good after all, was it? Or we might be amazed at how brilliant it was as well. So I set myself a couple of guidelines. One was, I was going to pick books that we do know did exist at one time and were referenced by other authors. Another was that I would pick 10 authors and only pick one book from each of them, even though, there are many books by some of these authors that I myself would love to have, because I wanted to have a nice distribution of them. Looking over it, there's, quite a few from what we can call pre-Socratic literature, some that are directly Socratic, and going all the way down to the time of Cicero. So we've got quite a few authors in there. So I'm just going to tell you what my list is. You're perfectly capable of coming up with your own lists. I would suggest that if you want to, figure out what's actually out there, one of the best places you can go to is Diogenes Laertes' Lives of the Philosophers, because he gives us lists of books, most of which we no longer have. But there's other places where you can find out about ancient literature as well. So no further ado, let me start with number one. And that is Heraclitus, the famous pre-Socratic philosopher, oftentimes called Heraclitus the Obscure. Perhaps he would be less obscure if we actually did possess what was seen to be his master work on nature. The fragments that we currently have are derived from, we think, from that, or from things that he's recorded as having said. It would be really interesting to actually have this, because there was apparently, we don't know if there was a continuity over time, but there were some people who were Heracliteans throughout the history of ancient philosophy. They probably were a small group, but perhaps they were reading his famous text, and it would be great to have access to it. So Heraclitus, number one. Another person who I think would be really cool to have some works by is an older sophist, right? And he was somebody who traveled around quite a bit, and that would be Protagoras. We think, there's no reason really to doubt this, that Socrates as a young man got to meet Protagoras in Athens. And Protagoras wrote quite a few books. The one that I think I would probably like to have the most, given what we know about him, is translated in Diogenes, the translator in English, calls it The Art of Controversy. In Greek, it's techne epistikon. So not necessarily controversy, but the art or the discipline of figuring things out, we might say. And Protagoras would be very interesting. It'd be to get to see him in his own words, not just represented by, say, Plato in a dialogue. Number three would be another one of these, people that we call the Sophists these days. That would be Gorgias. And Gorgias was a very interesting guy. He didn't claim to teach quite as much as some of the other sophists of the time did. He claimed just to be able to teach rhetoric, the art of persuasion. But we know that he had some sort of philosophical background as well. He wrote a book that's called a couple different things. It's called On Nature, but it's also called On Non-Existent, or On the Non-Existent. And in it, apparently, he took on Parmenides and the Eleatic school, who had argued that, there really is no motion. I mean, you can look at Zeno's paradoxes as examples of that. And he presented some counter theses, you could say. So that would be a really interesting work to have, particularly for me, as I have my own interest in discussions about nothingness, non-being, and its relationship with being and truth. Then we start to get to Socratic figures, and I would really like to have something by Antisthenes, one of Socrates' students. Apparently, Antisthenes wrote a lot of stuff, enough to fill 10 volumes, and we have exactly nothing of those works. So if looking through all of the things that he wrote, there's a lot of tempting things in there, but one that I would particularly like to have is translated, the title of it as Of Discussion, a Handbook of Debate. In Greek, peri to dialegesthai antilogikos. Peri to dialegesthai means about the topic of discussion back and forth. Dialege, working things through in speech. And then antilogikos has the sense of like speaking in response or against something else. So that would be, probably one of the most interesting works of him to have. Although, again, if we had access to this, maybe that one's not one of his better works, and one of the other ones would be more interesting to possess. Another key student of Socrates, who also founded his own school, Aristippus, he wrote not quite as much as some of these other thinkers, but he wrote quite a bit. And he's supposed to have written a book on virtue, Peri Aretes. So given that he is coming from the Socratic tradition, but he's deviating from it considerably in that he's a hedonist, he's saying pleasure is the good, I would love to actually be able to see what he thought virtue was and how we would make sense of it. And I'm sure in that book there'd be a lot more discussion about psychology and pleasure and pain and how to value things. So that would be very interesting to have. Then for number 6, I have somebody who's not a Socratic philosopher, but who would be kind of a contemporary. I'm actually doing this just a little bit out of order. Epicurus. Epicurus was supposed to have been one of the most prolific authors in antiquity, and unfortunately we have almost nothing that the guy wrote. What we do have is almost entirely due to the fact that Diogenes Laertes thought that Epicurus was so interesting that he actually copied out entire works, very short works, by hand and included them as the end of his Lives of the Philosophers. So if Diogenes hadn't done that, we probably would have lost all of Epicurus. He has a book, or he had a book, maybe we'll discover it someday, called On Nature, and it was 37 books. That means 37 scrolls worth of writing. That would be very interesting to read through, wouldn't it? Because apparently in ancient times, the Epicureans had access to that stuff, as did their opponents. Then we can jump back a little bit in time to Aristotle. I mean, these guys are more or less contemporaries. Now, Aristotle wrote a lot of stuff, and we do, in fact, have a lot of stuff that Aristotle wrote, and there was even stuff that Aristotle didn't write that survived that got attributed to Aristotle. But we are missing some things. And as opposed to some other people who'd say, oh, I want the second book of the Poetics, which was about comedy. That would be cool to have. I think one of the most interesting things would have been to possess one of the various constitutions that Aristotle and his students carried out as like case studies. And if we look at the one that we do have, the Constitution of Athens, it's like a history of all of the institutions and how they developed through time and the different transformations. So he did these of over 140 Greek city-states, including Athens. Which one would we want to have the most? I think a lot of people would say Sparta, but you know what I would actually want? I would want the Constitution of Thebes, because I think that could be very interesting, especially given the role that the Thebans played in recent history in Aristotle's own time. If we had other stuff on other peoples, then maybe I'd want that. But we think that it was just Greek city-states. So that is number 7. Number 8, the great Stoic author, really the founder of the school, Zeno. He wrote quite a few things, and I think one that a lot of people would want to have is his Republic, but I would rather have another work that Diogenes tells us that Zeno wrote, and that is called Of Life According to Nature. Now, why would I want that one in particular? Because it's such an important Stoic concept. There's so much discussion about it, and wouldn't it be cool to have the guy who got it started telling us what it actually meant for him in his own words at that time? Another author who's in the Stoic school, who, again, like Epicurus, was supposed to have been incredibly prolific, was Chyrsippius. And we have a really fascinating listing in Diogenes Laertes of all the books that Chyrsippius is supposed to have written. Most of them deal with argumentation and logical theory, so they're part of what the ancients called dialectic or logic. I'm more interested in the ethical stuff. So what I would, if I only could have one book by Chyrsippius, and again, this is like reaching into a grab bag and you don't know what you're really going to get, I would want his book on habit, perihexeos, because it's such an important concept, not just for the Stoics, but in ancient philosophy in general. And I would love to see what Chyrsippius himself had to say about this and what he said in relation to the other schools of the time, because he spent a lot of time in polemics against them. The last one that I would want to have is, again, by an author who we possess quite a bit of, some of which we only possess in fragments or in texts that give out at a certain point. And that would be Cicero. Cicero wrote a book called the Hortensius, and we don't have it, but a lot of people in the ancient world did, and it turned out to be very influential. It's sort of an introduction to philosophy. And given that Cicero's whole project was, taking Greek philosophy, putting it into a Latin and Roman setting and creating almost like an encyclopedia, wouldn't it be nice to have this? We know that it influenced Lactantius and Augustine and Boethius and other people, and then it disappears from the scene, so we don't really get much of a chance to see what was in it. There's a few fragments from it, a few passages, but we don't have too much. So those are my top 10 works from antiquity that I wish we had. I think, this is not a list that a lot of people would agree with. There's probably many other works and thinkers that some of my viewers would rather have, and you can certainly put those in the comments. But those are the ones that I would most like to have, and the reasonings why that's the case.